"Sir, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and move to the back of the aircraft where you belong because frankly you don't have the class or the character to sit among our VIP passengers." Those words, spoken with the cold authority of a man who believed his uniform made him untouchable, would within minutes destroy a 20-year career and expose a pattern of discrimination that had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. Captain Derek Morrison thought he was protecting his precious first-class cabin from what he saw as an unsuitable passenger. He had no idea he was staring down the newly appointed director of the Federal Aviation Administration, a man whose signature was required for Derek to keep his pilot's license. In exactly 12 minutes, Derek Morrison's world would collapse, not with the dramatic explosion of a plane crash, but with the quiet, devastating power of a federal badge. The alarm clock's harsh buzzing cut through the silence of Derek Morrison's suburban bedroom at exactly 5:30 a.m., but he was already awake, staring at the ceiling fan that had been making the same grinding noise for 3 months. He'd been meaning to fix it, just like he'd been meaning to fix a lot of things in his life that seemed to be slowly falling apart. Derek rolled out of the king-sized bed that felt too big for one person, his feet hitting the cold hardwood floor of the house that used to feel like home before his wife Sarah took the kids and moved back to her mother's place in Denver. The bathroom mirror reflected back a man who looked older than his 45 years, with silver threading through hair that had once been the envy of every pilot in the crew lounge. Derek Morrison had the kind of classic good looks that belonged on recruitment posters for major airlines, the square jaw and steady blue eyes that passengers wanted to see when they were placing their lives in a pilot's hands. But this morning, those same eyes were bloodshot from another sleepless night, spent calculating how much his alimony payments were eating into his salary and wondering if he'd ever see his teenage daughter Emma again without having to schedule it through lawyers. He moved through his morning routine with the mechanical precision that had served him well throughout his military training and his subsequent career in commercial aviation. Coffee, first always black brewed in the same machine Sarah had bought him for their 10th wedding anniversary. Then 15 minutes of stretching exercises to keep his back from seizing up during long flights, followed by a quick scan of the weather reports and flight delays that would determine whether today would be smooth sailing or another test of his increasingly frayed patience. On his dresser sat a small wooden display case containing his father's vintage pilot wings from the Korean War, the gold medal still gleaming despite being nearly 70 years old. Colonel James Morrison had been the kind of man who commanded respect without demanding it, who led by example rather than by intimidation. Derek picked up the wings and held them to the light, remembering how proud he'd felt the day he earned his own commercial pilot's license, how his father had clapped him on the shoulder and said he'd never been prouder of anything in his life. That was back when Derek believed that wearing a uniform automatically made you a hero, before he learned that respect had to be earned fresh every single day. The drive to Chicago O'Hare through the pre-dawn darkness gave Derek time to think, which lately had become more of a curse than a blessing. His black BMW navigated the familiar route while he mentally rehearsed the performance review meeting that was scheduled for next week, the one that would determine whether he'd finally get the promotion to chief pilot he'd been chasing for the past 3 years. The competition was fierce, and Derek knew that every flight between now and then would be scrutinized for any sign of weakness or unprofessionalism. He couldn't afford a single mistake, not with his divorce settlement requiring monthly payments that left him living paycheck to paycheck, despite earning what most people would consider an excellent salary. The weather forecast was calling for storms across the Midwest, which meant delays frustrated passengers and the kind of pressure cooker environment where even experienced pilots could make career-ending mistakes. Derek pulled into the employee parking garage and sat in his car for a moment, watching other crew members hurrying toward the terminal entrance with their rolling flight bags and coffee cups, all of them part of an industry that had become increasingly unforgiving of human error. He thought about the time 3 years ago when he'd helped an elderly passenger who'd collapsed in the first-class aisle during a flight from Chicago to Miami. Derek had immediately diverted to the nearest airport, coordinated with medical personnel on the ground, and personally stayed with the man's family until the ambulance arrived. The airline had commended him for his compassion and quick thinking, and for weeks afterward, Derek had felt like the kind of pilot he'd always wanted to be. But somewhere along the way, between the divorce papers and the mounting financial pressure, and the constant fear of losing everything he'd worked for, that compassionate man had gotten buried under layers of anxiety and barely controlled desperation. As he walked through the terminal toward the crew briefing room, Derek caught his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows and straightened his shoulders, adjusted his tie, and forced his face into the mask of confident professionalism that passengers expected to see. Today's flight to Atlanta was carrying several VIP passengers, including a senator and a high-profile tech entrepreneur, which meant everything had to be perfect. Derek Morrison couldn't afford to be anything less than flawless, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to maintain the standards that his career depended on. The crew briefing room at Chicago O'Hare buzzed with the familiar energy of pilots and flight attendants preparing for another day of keeping hundreds of passengers safe while hurtling through the sky at 600 miles per hour. Derek Morrison entered the room with the kind of measured confidence that came from 2 decades of commanding aircraft worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime, nodding to familiar faces while keeping his expression appropriately serious. Today's flight, UA 847 to Atlanta, was one of the premium routes that the airline used to showcase their first-class service, which meant every detail had to be executed flawlessly. First Officer Kevin Chen was already reviewing the flight plan when Derek approached their assigned table, and Derek felt the familiar mixture of admiration and envy that Kevin's youthful enthusiasm always triggered. At 28, Kevin had the kind of eager professionalism that reminded Derek of his own early years in commercial aviation, back when every flight felt like an adventure rather than another step on a treadmill that never seemed to lead anywhere. Kevin had graduated at the top of his class from the United Airlines training program, spoke 3 languages fluently, and possessed the kind of natural flying instincts that couldn't be taught in any classroom. "Morning, Captain Morrison," Kevin said, looking up from his weather charts with a slight frown of concern. "Looks like we've got some significant storm activity developing over Tennessee and northern Alabama. Nothing we can't handle, but it might mean some route adjustments and possible delays if the system moves faster than predicted." Derek studied the weather radar images on Kevin's tablet, noting the angry red and orange patches that indicated severe turbulence and potential microbursts. "We'll monitor it closely," he replied, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that had made him one of the airline's most trusted senior pilots. "If we need to deviate around the worst of it, we'll coordinate with air traffic control and keep the passengers informed. The last thing we need is a bunch of nervous VIPs wondering why their expensive tickets aren't buying them smooth air." Lead flight attendant Linda Martinez approached their table carrying a steaming cup of coffee and the passenger manifest for their flight. Linda was a 15-year veteran of commercial aviation who'd seen every possible combination of passenger personalities and crew dynamics, and Derek had learned to respect her judgment when it came to managing the delicate social ecosystem of a premium cabin. She had an intuitive understanding of how to handle difficult passengers without escalating conflicts, and her ability to maintain professional composure under pressure had saved Derek from several potentially embarrassing situations over the years. "Captain, we've got quite a distinguished passenger list today," Linda said, settling into the chair across from Derek and Kevin. "Senator Patricia Williams is in 1A, flying back to Atlanta for some kind of healthcare committee hearing. She's been on our flights before, very professional, no special requests beyond making sure she has privacy for phone calls. In 1C, we have James Sullivan, the tech entrepreneur, who founded that new electric vehicle company that's been all over the news lately. His assistant called ahead to request vegetarian meals and extra legroom, which we've already accommodated." Derek nodded approvingly while scanning the rest of the manifest, noting the mixture of business travelers, tourists, and what appeared to be several families heading to Atlanta for vacation. First class was nearly full, which meant premium revenue for the airline and the kind of service expectations that left no room for error. "Any special security concerns or medical needs I should be aware of?" he asked, running his finger down the list of names and seat assignments. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Linda replied, though Derek noticed a slight hesitation in her voice. "We do have one passenger in 2B who purchased his ticket at the last minute with cash, which flagged in our security screening, but his background check came back clean. David Washington, no middle initial, no frequent flyer status or upgrade history in our records. Could be a one-time business traveler or someone who usually flies with other carriers." Kevin looked up from his pre-flight calculations with interest. Cash purchase for a first-class ticket to Atlanta. That's what, $4,000? Must be nice to have that kind of disposable income. Derek felt a familiar tightening in his chest at the mention of money, a reminder of his own financial pressures and the monthly alimony payments that made even his substantial pilot salary feel inadequate. "As long as he's cleared security and has a valid ticket, it's not our concern how he pays for it," Derek said, though something about the last-minute cash purchase struck him as unusual. In his experience, the passengers who could afford first-class tickets on major carriers were typically business travelers with corporate accounts or wealthy individuals who booked through travel agents and had extensive loyalty program histories. Linda gathered her papers and stood to begin her pre-flight cabin preparation. "I'll make sure everything is set up perfectly for our VIP passengers," she said, giving Derek the kind of knowing look that acknowledged the extra pressure they were all under to maintain the airline's reputation for excellence. "Senator Williams' office specifically mentioned that she needs to make some confidential phone calls during the flight, so I'll brief the other attendants about giving her extra privacy." As Linda walked away, Derek found himself thinking about the upcoming performance review and how a flawless execution of today's flight could help position him for the chief pilot promotion he desperately needed. The increase in salary would finally give him some breathing room financially, and more importantly, it would prove to Sarah and the kids that he was still capable of achieving something meaningful with his career. Derek Morrison had spent his entire adult life building his identity around being a pilot, and the thought of losing that identity to divorce proceedings and financial pressures was more terrifying than any emergency he'd ever faced in the cockpit. The weather outside the briefing room windows was beginning to deteriorate, with dark clouds gathering on the horizon and the first drops of rain starting to streak the glass. Derek finished his coffee and gathered his flight materials, knowing that the next few hours would test every skill he'd developed over 2 decades of commercial flying. What he didn't know was that his greatest challenge wouldn't come from the storm clouds outside, but from the assumptions and prejudices he carried within himself. David Washington stood in the bathroom of his modest hotel room near Chicago O'Hare, studying his reflection in the mirror while mentally preparing for one of the most important assignments of his career with the Federal Aviation Administration. At 42, David had the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of military service, followed by a steady rise through the ranks of Federal Aviation Safety Oversight. His broad shoulders and calloused hands told the story of a man who'd worked his way up from aircraft maintenance to pilot training to his current position as Director of Field Operations. But today, those same hands were deliberately choosing clothes that would make him nearly invisible to the kind of people who made assumptions based on appearance. The charcoal gray hoodie was expensive, but understated the kind of high-quality garment that looked casual at first glance, but revealed its craftsmanship to anyone who bothered to look closely. David paired it with dark jeans that fit perfectly and comfortable sneakers that had seen better days but were broken and just right for a long flight. The overall effect was carefully calculated to present the image of someone who could afford a first-class ticket, but didn't necessarily look like he belonged in the world of corporate executives and political power players who typically occupied those premium seats. This undercover audit had been months in the planning, triggered by a disturbing pattern of passenger complaints that suggested certain airlines were treating travelers differently based on their appearance race or perceived social status. David's job was to experience firsthand how airline crews responded to a black passenger who didn't fit their preconceived notions of who belonged in first class, and then use that evidence to implement stronger anti-discrimination policies across the entire industry. It was delicate work that required him to walk a fine line between documenting problems and maintaining his cover long enough to gather meaningful data. David's phone buzzed with a text message from his wife, Michelle. "Good luck today, honey. Remember that whatever happens, you're doing this to make flying safer and more fair for everyone, including our kids." Their teenagers, Marcus and Aisha, were old enough to understand why their father sometimes had to travel for work, wearing ordinary clothes instead of his usual business suits, and both had inherited his quiet determination to fight injustice wherever they found it. David smiled as he thought about Marcus, who was following in his footsteps with plans to study aeronautical engineering, and Aisha, who wanted to become a civil rights lawyer and had already started volunteering with organizations that fought discrimination. The taxi ride to O'Hare gave David time to review his cover story and documentation one final time. According to his carefully crafted identity, David Washington was a freelance technology consultant traveling to Atlanta for a client meeting someone successful enough to afford first-class tickets, but not connected to any major corporation or government agency. His credit card's identification and even his phone number all supported this fiction, and his years of experience in federal law enforcement had taught him how to maintain a believable cover under pressure. As he entered the terminal, David began his real work observing how airline employees interacted with different types of passengers and noting any patterns of differential treatment. He watched a well-dressed white businessman get expedited service at the check-in counter, while a Hispanic family with small children waited in the regular line despite having identical ticket types. He noticed how security personnel seemed to select certain passengers for additional screening based on factors that had nothing to do with legitimate security concerns. At the first-class check-in counter, David presented his identification and boarding pass to a young airline employee who looked surprised by his casual attire, but processed his documents without comment. "Mr. Washington, you're confirmed in seat 2B today," the agent said with professional politeness. "You'll be boarding in Group 1, which begins in about 20 minutes. Is there anything special you need during your flight today?" "Just a quiet trip and maybe some coffee," David replied with the kind of easy smile that had always helped him connect with people from all walks of life. "I've got some reading to catch up on, so I'm hoping for a smooth flight." The gate area was filling up with the usual mixture of business travelers, families, and tourists that characterized flights between major cities. David found a seat near the boarding area and pulled out a worn paperback novel, though his attention was really focused on observing the interactions between passengers and crew members. He noticed how some travelers were treated with immediate respect and accommodation, while others faced subtle skepticism or indifference that seemed to correlate with their appearance or perceived social status. When Group 1 boarding was announced, David gathered his single carry-on bag and joined the line of first-class passengers. He'd deliberately chosen the oldest, most battered leather duffel bag he owned, something that looked like it had survived years of military deployments and business travel, but didn't scream expensive designer luggage. As he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, David noticed her slight double-take at his casual attire, but she scanned his ticket without comment and welcomed him aboard with the same professional courtesy she'd shown the other premium passengers. Walking down the jet bridge toward the aircraft, David felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension that came with undercover work. He hoped to find that his concerns about discriminatory treatment were unfounded, that the complaints his office had received were isolated incidents rather than indicators of widespread problems. But his years of experience investigating aviation safety issues had taught him that patterns of behavior rarely emerged without underlying cultural problems that needed to be addressed. As he stepped aboard the aircraft and made his way toward Seat 2B, David Washington had no idea that his presence in the first-class cabin would trigger a confrontation that would expose not just individual prejudices, but an entire pattern of discrimination that had been hiding behind uniforms and professional protocols for far too long. The Boeing 737-800 gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the gate area as passengers began filing aboard Flight 847. Their conversations and footsteps creating the familiar symphony of departure preparations that Derek Morrison had heard thousands of times throughout his career. From the cockpit door, Derek watched the boarding process with the practiced eye of a pilot who understood that passenger management was just as crucial to flight safety as weather monitoring and mechanical systems. Today's load was nearly full, with first class completely sold out, and the economy cabin packed with a mixture of business travelers and families heading to Atlanta for various reasons. Derek's pre-flight ritual included a personal walkthrough of the passenger cabin, ostensibly to check that everything was secure and properly stowed, but really to get a sense of the human dynamics he'd be managing for the next 2.5 hours. It was a habit he'd developed early in his career based on the belief that understanding his passengers as individuals rather than just seat numbers made him a better captain. Over the years, this personal touch had earned him numerous commendations from airline management and grateful letters from passengers who appreciated his attention to detail. Senator Patricia Williams was already settled in Seat 1, reading what appeared to be a briefing document while sipping a glass of orange juice. Derek recognized her from news coverage of various healthcare debates, and he made a mental note to ensure that her flight experience was flawless, knowing that VIP passengers often had direct lines of communication to airline executives and federal transportation officials. In Seat 1C, tech entrepreneur James Sullivan was setting up his laptop and arranging what looked like a mobile office complete with noise-canceling headphones and a stack of business documents. It was when Derek's eyes moved to Seat 2B that his carefully maintained professional composure began to crack. The passenger sitting there was clearly out of place among the business suits and designer accessories that typically populated the first-class cabin. A young black man in a gray hoodie and jeans carrying what appeared to be a battered military surplus duffel bag was calmly arranging his belongings in the overhead compartment with the kind of efficient movements that suggested extensive travel experience. Derek felt an immediate cognitive dissonance that he couldn't quite explain, a gut-level reaction that something was wrong with this picture. In his 20 years of flying commercial routes, the passengers who occupied first-class seats typically fell into predictable categories: corporate executives in expensive suits, wealthy retirees and designer casual wear politicians and celebrities who dressed to project authority and success. This passenger looked more like someone who belonged in the back of the plane, maybe traveling on a discounted ticket or using frequent flyer miles to upgrade from economy. The rational part of Derek's mind recognized that appearances could be deceiving, that wealth and status came in many forms, and that anyone with a valid first-class ticket had every right to occupy their assigned seat, regardless of how they chose to dress. But the irrational part of his brain, the part that had been poisoned by years of financial stress and personal disappointments, whispered that something wasn't right about this situation. The last-minute cash purchase that Linda had mentioned suddenly seemed more significant, and Derek found himself wondering what kind of person paid $4,000 in cash for an airline ticket. Derek signaled to Linda Martinez, who was checking seatbelts and serving pre-departure beverages to the first-class passengers. She approached the galley area where Derek was standing with her usual professional efficiency, though he could see a slight question in her eyes about why he was lingering in the passenger cabin instead of completing his cockpit preparations. "Linda, I need you to do me a favor," Derek said, keeping his voice low and his expression neutral. "The passenger in 2B, Mr. Washington, I want you to verify his identification one more time and make sure his ticket purchase was properly processed. Something about the last-minute cash transaction doesn't sit right with me, and with the VIP passengers we're carrying today, I want to be absolutely certain everything is legitimate." Linda followed Derek's gaze toward David Washington, who was now seated comfortably and reading what appeared to be a technical manual of some kind. Captain, I already checked his documents during boarding and everything appeared to be in order. His ID matches the name on the ticket and the gate agents confirmed that his payment was processed correctly. Is there something specific that's concerning you? Derek struggled to articulate his unease without sounding like he was profiling a passenger based on appearance, though that was exactly what his instincts were telling him to do. It's not just the cash purchase, he said, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. Look at him, Linda. Does he really look like he belongs in first class? I mean, a hoodie and jeans among all these business professionals? What if he's using a stolen credit card or falsified documents? What if he's planning something that could put our other passengers at risk? Linda Martinez had been in the airline industry long enough to recognize the dangerous territory that Derek was approaching, and she felt a growing discomfort with the direction of their conversation. In her 15 years of service, she'd seen passengers from all walks of life occupy first-class seats, and she'd learned that making assumptions based on clothing or appearance was not only unprofessional, but potentially illegal under federal anti-discrimination laws. Captain, with all due respect, Mr. Washington has been nothing but polite and professional since he boarded, Linda said carefully. He's not bothering the other passengers, he's following all safety protocols and his documentation checked out completely. I don't think we have grounds to single him out for additional scrutiny based solely on his appearance. Derek felt his authority being questioned, and the stress of his upcoming performance review made him more defensive than usual. Linda, I'm not asking you to question my judgment here. I'm the captain of this aircraft, and if I have concerns about passenger behavior or documentation, it's your job to help me address those concerns. I want you to approach Mr. Washington again and ask to see his ID and boarding pass one more time. If he's legitimate, he won't have any problem complying with a routine security check. As Derek watched Linda reluctantly approach David Washington's seat, he told himself that he was simply being thorough and professional, protecting his VIP passengers from any potential disruption or security threat. But deep in his mind, a small voice whispered that his real motivation had nothing to do with security, and everything to do with his own discomfort at seeing someone who didn't match his expectations sitting in a space he considered reserved for people like himself. David Washington looked up from his reading as Linda approached, his expression calm and patient, despite the obvious irregularity of being asked for documentation a second time. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his identification with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested he was accustomed to having his credentials questioned, though Derek couldn't see the slight tightening around David's eyes that indicated this wasn't the first time his presence in a premium space had been challenged. What Derek Morrison didn't know, as he watched this interaction from the galley area, was that David Washington was documenting every aspect of their exchange in his memory, noting the time, the circumstances, and the apparent motivations behind what was clearly discriminatory treatment disguised as routine security procedures. The federal investigation that would eventually destroy Derek's career had already begun, and Derek himself was providing all the evidence that would be needed to prove a pattern of bias that extended far beyond this single flight. Linda Martinez approached seat 2B with the kind of professional smile that she'd perfected over 15 years of managing difficult situations at 35,000 feet. But inside, she felt deeply uncomfortable about what Captain Morrison was asking her to do. She'd worked with Derek on dozens of flights and had always respected his dedication to passenger safety and service excellence. But something about his fixation on Mr. Washington struck her as problematic in ways that made her question whether she was witnessing the beginning of a discrimination incident. "Mr. Washington, I'm so sorry to bother you again," Linda said, her voice carrying genuine apology as she stopped beside his seat. "We're having some technical issues with our passenger manifest system, and I need to verify your identification one more time just to make sure everything matches up correctly in our records. It's purely routine, but I know it's an inconvenience." David Washington looked up from the technical manual he'd been reading, and Linda noticed the quiet intelligence in his eyes as he assessed the situation. There was no anger or irritation in his expression, just a kind of weary recognition that suggested he'd been through similar experiences before. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his driver's license with movements that were deliberate and visible, clearly understanding that any sudden gestures might be misinterpreted. "Of course," David said, his voice carrying the polished diction of someone who'd spent years in professional environments where clear communication was essential. "I understand that airlines have to be thorough about security procedures, especially in first class. Here's my license, and I still have my boarding pass if you need to check that as well." Linda examined the identification carefully, noting that David Washington's address was listed in Arlington, Virginia, not far from Washington, D.C., which explained his expensive casual clothing and his comfort with air travel. The license appeared completely legitimate, with all the proper security features and no signs of tampering or alteration. His boarding pass showed seat 2B with a timestamp indicating that his ticket had been purchased 36 hours earlier, not exactly last minute in airline terms. "Everything looks perfect, Mr. Washington," Linda said, returning his documents with another apologetic smile. "Thank you for being so patient with our procedures. Is there anything I can get you before we push back from the gate? Coffee water, or perhaps something stronger?" "Just water would be fine, thank you," David replied, tucking his identification back into his jacket. "No ice, please, and don't worry about the verification request. I know you're just doing your job." As Linda walked back toward the galley area, she noticed that Senator Williams had looked up from her briefing documents and was observing the interaction with obvious interest. The senator's expression suggested that she'd recognized the unusual nature of asking a passenger for identification twice, and Linda hoped that whatever was driving Captain Morrison's suspicions wouldn't escalate into the kind of public confrontation that could damage everyone's career. Derek was waiting near the first-class galley with barely concealed impatience, his eyes fixed on Linda's face as she approached with David Washington's information. "Well," he asked, keeping his voice low, but not bothering to hide his expectation that she'd found something problematic with the passenger's documentation. "Captain, everything checks out perfectly," Linda reported, though she could see disappointment and frustration flickering across Derek's features. "His identification is completely legitimate. His ticket was purchased 36 hours ago through normal channels, and he's been nothing but polite and cooperative. There's absolutely nothing suspicious about Mr. Washington or his presence in first class." Derek felt a surge of irritation that he struggled to keep hidden from the other passengers who might be watching their conversation. The rational part of his mind knew that Linda was right, that a passenger's appearance or clothing choices weren't legitimate grounds for additional security screening, but something about David Washington's presence continued to bother him in ways he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. "I still don't like it," Derek muttered, glancing back toward seat 2B, where David had returned to his reading. "He doesn't fit the profile of our typical first-class passenger, and with Senator Williams and Mr. Sullivan on board, I don't want any disruptions or incidents that could reflect poorly on our service standards. Keep an eye on him during the flight and let me know immediately if he does anything that seems out of place." Linda nodded reluctantly, understanding that she was caught between following her captain's orders and maintaining her own professional integrity. She'd seen enough discrimination incidents during her airline career to recognize the warning signs, and Derek's fixation on a passenger who had done absolutely nothing wrong was setting off alarm bells in her mind. But challenging a captain's authority was a serious matter that could have significant consequences for her own career, especially when they were dealing with high-profile passengers who expected flawless service. Meanwhile, in seat 2, David Washington was quietly documenting the interaction in a small notebook that looked like a personal journal but was actually an official record of his undercover investigation. He wrote down the time of Linda's second identification request, her obvious discomfort with having to make it, and his observation that the request seemed to have originated from the flight crew rather than from any legitimate security protocol. David had conducted enough undercover investigations to recognize the pattern of escalating scrutiny that often preceded more serious discriminatory actions. The fact that his identification had been checked twice while other passengers in first class hadn't been approached at all suggested that he was being singled out for treatment that had nothing to do with legitimate security concerns and everything to do with assumptions about who belonged in premium cabin spaces. First Officer Kevin Chen emerged from the cockpit to conduct his own pre-flight safety check, and David noticed the young pilot's friendly nod as he passed through the cabin. Kevin's demeanor was relaxed and professional, suggesting that the additional security concerns seemed to be originating specifically from Captain Morrison rather than from the flight crew as a whole. David made a mental note of this observation, understanding that it might be important for distinguishing between individual bias and institutional discrimination. As the aircraft prepared for pushback from the gate, David Washington settled back into his seat and continued his reading, projecting the calm confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was sitting. But internally he was preparing for the possibility that Captain Morrison's suspicions might escalate into more direct confrontation, and he was already planning how he would document and respond to whatever came next while maintaining his undercover identity for as long as possible. The storm clouds gathering outside the aircraft windows seemed to mirror the tension building inside the first-class cabin, where assumptions about race class and belonging were about to collide with federal authority in ways that none of the participants could yet imagine. The pre-flight safety demonstration concluded without incident, but Derek Morrison found himself unable to concentrate on his usual cockpit preparations, as his attention kept drifting back to the passenger in seat 2B, who seemed to represent everything that was wrong with his carefully ordered world. Through the cockpit door's small window, Derek could see David Washington calmly reading his technical manual while other first-class passengers settled in for the flight, and the sight triggered a growing sense of unease that Derek couldn't shake despite Linda's assurance that everything was legitimate. Kevin Chen was running through the final items on their pre-flight checklist when Derek abruptly stood up from the captain's seat and announced that he needed to conduct one more cabin inspection before pushback. Kevin looked surprised by this deviation from their normal routine, since Derek had already completed his passenger walkthrough 20 minutes earlier. But first officers learned early in their careers not to question a captain's decisions unless safety was directly at stake. "Captain, we're already running about 15 minutes behind schedule due to the weather delays," Kevin observed, consulting his watch and the departure slot time that air traffic control had assigned them. "Is there something specific you need to check that we missed during the earlier inspection?" Derek adjusted his uniform jacket and straightened his tie with movements that betrayed his inner agitation, despite his attempt to project calm authority. "I want to personally verify that all our passenger documentation is properly processed before we leave the gate," he said, though they both knew that such verification was typically handled by gate agents and flight attendants rather than by the flight crew. "With the VIP passengers we're carrying today, I don't want any surprises once we're airborne." Walking back into the first-class cabin, Derek immediately noticed that Senator Williams had put away her briefing documents and was now observing the pre-flight activities with the kind of sharp attention that veteran politicians brought to any environment where power dynamics were at play. James Sullivan had his laptop open and was typing rapidly, though Derek caught him glancing up periodically, as if sensing some underlying tension in the cabin atmosphere. Derek approached seat 2B with the measured stride of someone accustomed to being the ultimate authority in any situation involving commercial aviation. But David Washington's calm composure seemed to radiate a quiet confidence that made Derek feel somehow diminished despite his uniform and rank. David looked up from his reading with polite attention, though Derek noticed that his posture remained relaxed and unthreatening. "Mr. Washington," Derek said, his voice carrying the formal tone he typically reserved for addressing passengers who had violated safety regulations or caused disturbances. "I'm Captain Morrison, and I'd like to personally welcome you aboard our flight today. As part of our enhanced security protocols for flights carrying high-profile passengers, I need to verify your identification and boarding documentation one final time." David closed his book and regarded Derek with the kind of steady gaze that made it clear he understood exactly what was happening, but was choosing to remain professional despite the obvious irregularity of a captain personally requesting passenger documents. "Certainly, Captain Morrison," David replied, reaching into his jacket with deliberate visible movements. "Though I should mention that your flight attendant already verified my identification twice during the boarding process." "I understand that, sir, but as captain of this aircraft I have the final authority over all security matters," Derek said, accepting David's driver's license and boarding pass while trying to project an image of reasonable caution rather than discriminatory targeting. "I'm sure you can understand that in today's security environment we can't be too careful about verifying that all passengers are exactly who they claim to be." Derek examined the documents with exaggerated thoroughness, looking for any discrepancy or irregularity that might justify his suspicions, but David Washington's identification was obviously legitimate, and his boarding pass showed all the proper security codes and timestamps. The license photograph clearly matched the man sitting in seat 2B, and the address in Arlington, Virginia, suggested someone with the financial means to afford first-class tickets on major airlines. "Mr. Washington, I noticed that you purchased this ticket with cash rather than through the usual corporate or credit card channels." Derek continued his tone, becoming slightly more aggressive as he failed to find any obvious problems with the documentation. "Can you explain the circumstances that led to this unusual payment method? Are you traveling on business, or is this a personal trip?" David maintained his composed expression despite the increasingly intrusive nature of Derek's questions, understanding that he was being subjected to exactly the kind of discriminatory treatment that his investigation was designed to document. "I'm a freelance technology consultant traveling to Atlanta for a client meeting," David replied, which was technically true, even though it omitted his actual role with the Federal Aviation Administration. "I prefer to pay cash when possible because it simplifies my business accounting and expense reporting." Derek felt his frustration mounting as David's answers continued to be reasonable and professional, offering no justification for the security concerns that Derek was trying to manufacture. The other first-class passengers were beginning to notice the extended conversation with Senator Williams, watching the interaction with obvious interest, and several passengers in nearby seats turning their attention away from their phones and magazines. "Sir, I need to ask you about the nature of your business in Atlanta." Derek pressed his voice, rising slightly, as he abandoned any pretense that this was a routine security check. "What kind of technology consulting requires last-minute travel and cash payments? Who exactly are you meeting with, and can you provide any documentation that verifies the legitimacy of your business activities?" The cabin fell noticeably quieter as Derek's interrogation became impossible to ignore, and Linda Martinez appeared at Derek's shoulder with a concerned expression that made it clear she was uncomfortable with the direction their captain was taking. David Washington remained perfectly still in his seat, his hands visible, and his demeanor calm, but Derek could see a subtle shift in his expression that suggested a growing awareness of the serious nature of what was happening. "Captain Morrison," David said, his voice carrying a new edge of formality that hadn't been present during their earlier exchanges. "I've provided you with all the identification and documentation that federal law requires from airline passengers. Unless you have specific articulable security concerns that are based on something other than my appearance, or your assumptions about who belongs in first class, I believe this questioning has gone far beyond what's appropriate or legal." Derek felt a surge of anger at having his authority challenged by a passenger who didn't seem to understand the gravity of defying a commercial pilot's commands, and the stress of his upcoming performance review made him more combative than prudent. "Mr. Washington, I'm going to need you to step into the galley area where we can continue this conversation privately," Derek announced, loud enough for most of the first-class cabin to hear. "I have serious concerns about your suitability for this flight, and we need to resolve this matter before we can proceed with departure." As Derek waited for David to comply with his demand, he had no idea that he had just crossed a legal and professional line that would trigger a federal investigation, destroy his career, and expose a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been hiding behind the authority of his pilot's uniform for far too long. The first-class cabin of Flight 847 had become an unwilling theater for a confrontation that would be remembered and analyzed for years to come as Derek Morrison's demands for David Washington to move to the galley area created a moment of electric tension that made every passenger acutely aware they were witnessing something far beyond normal airline operations. David remained seated with the kind of dignified composure that spoke to years of military training and federal service, while Derek stood in the aisle with his captain's uniform somehow making him appear smaller rather than more authoritative. "Sir, I'm going to need you to comply with my request immediately," Derek said, his voice carrying a hard edge that reflected his growing frustration with David's calm refusal to be intimidated. "As captain of this aircraft, I have the absolute authority to determine passenger suitability for flight, and your evasive answers to my legitimate security questions have raised serious concerns about your intentions and background." Senator Patricia Williams had set aside all pretense of reading her briefing documents and was now watching the confrontation with the sharp attention of someone who had spent decades recognizing abuse of power when she saw it. From her seat in 1A, she had an unobstructed view of both men and could clearly see the contrast between Derek's agitated body language and David's controlled stillness, a dynamic that reminded her of countless congressional hearings where institutional authority tried to intimidate individuals who refused to be cowed. "Captain Morrison," David replied, his voice remaining level despite the obvious escalation in Derek's behavior. "I have answered all your questions truthfully and provided all the documentation required by Federal Aviation regulations. I am a paying passenger with a valid ticket who has committed no violation of airline policies or safety protocols. I will not be moving from my assigned seat unless you can provide specific articulable reasons that are based on legitimate security concerns rather than personal assumptions." Derek felt the eyes of the entire first-class cabin focused on their exchange, and his awareness that Senator Williams and other influential passengers were watching made him more determined than ever to assert his authority and prove that his suspicions were justified. The stress of his upcoming performance review, combined with months of financial pressure from his divorce, had created a perfect storm of desperation that clouded his judgment and made him incapable of recognizing how badly he was mishandling the situation. "Mr. Washington, your refusal to cooperate with a legitimate security inquiry is itself a violation of federal regulations regarding compliance with flight crew instructions," Derek announced, raising his voice enough that passengers in the economy section could hear him clearly. "Furthermore, your presence in first class appears to be making other passengers uncomfortable, and I have a responsibility to ensure the safety and comfort of all travelers on this aircraft." James Sullivan looked up from his laptop with obvious confusion and concern since David Washington had done nothing that could reasonably be described as making anyone uncomfortable, and the only source of tension in the cabin seemed to be Derek Morrison's increasingly aggressive behavior. Several other passengers were now openly recording the confrontation with their phones, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something that would likely have significant consequences for everyone involved. Linda Martinez stepped forward from her position near the galley, her 15 years of experience in commercial aviation telling her that Derek was approaching a point of no return that would have catastrophic consequences for his career and potentially for the airline's reputation. "Captain, perhaps we could resolve this situation by discussing it privately rather than continuing to involve the other passengers," she suggested, though her carefully neutral tone couldn't hide her deep discomfort with what was happening. "Linda, I've made my decision based on legitimate security concerns, and I need Mr. Washington to comply with my instructions immediately." Derek snapped his patience, finally exhausted by what he perceived as insubordination from both his flight attendant and his problematic passenger. Mr. Washington, you have 30 seconds to gather your belongings and move to the galley area, or I will be forced to call airport security to have you removed from this aircraft for non-compliance with crew member instructions. David Washington remained motionless in his seat, his hands folded calmly in his lap as he made a decision that would alter the trajectory of Derek Morrison's life in ways that neither man could yet imagine. "Captain Morrison," David said, his voice carrying a new quality of authority that made several passengers lean forward to hear him more clearly. "I want to be absolutely clear about what's happening here. You are attempting to remove a passenger from his paid seat based solely on his appearance and your personal assumptions about who belongs in first class. This is not a security matter, and it is not a matter of passenger comfort. This is discrimination, and it is illegal under federal civil rights law." Derek felt a moment of panic as David's words cut through his rationalization and forced him to confront the reality of his actions. But his pride and his desperate need to maintain authority in front of the watching passengers made it impossible for him to back down. "Mr. Washington, I am the captain of this aircraft, and my word is final," Derek declared, his voice rising to a shout that carried throughout the entire plane. "You are disrupting the premium cabin environment, you have failed to provide satisfactory answers to legitimate security questions, and you are hereby banned from first-class seating for the duration of this flight. Gather your belongings immediately and move to economy class where you belong, or I will have you arrested for interfering with flight operations." The words, "where you belong," hung in the air like a toxic cloud, their discriminatory implications impossible to ignore or rationalize away. And Derek Morrison realized too late that he had just publicly admitted to exactly the kind of bias-based treatment that could end careers and trigger federal investigations. David Washington reached into his jacket pocket with the same deliberate movements he had used throughout their confrontation, but this time he withdrew something that would change everything. "Captain Morrison," David said, his voice now carrying the full authority of the United States federal government, "my name is David Washington, and I am the Director of Field Operations for the Federal Aviation Administration. You have just committed multiple violations of federal anti-discrimination law, while your entire conversation has been recorded by passengers throughout this cabin. This aircraft is hereby grounded, pending a full investigation of discriminatory practices, and your pilot's license is suspended effective immediately." The federal badge that David held up gleamed under the cabin lights, and Derek Morrison felt his world collapse around him as he realized that his career, his reputation, and his life as he knew it had just ended because he couldn't see past his own prejudices to recognize the humanity of a fellow passenger. The federal badge in David Washington's hand seemed to catch and reflect every light in the first-class cabin, creating a moment of absolute silence that felt like the pause between lightning and thunder. Derek Morrison stared at the identification with the expression of a man watching his entire life collapse. In real time, his face cycling through disbelief, panic, and a desperate hope that this was somehow an elaborate mistake or misunderstanding that could still be explained away. "That's impossible," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible as he processed the reality of what David had just revealed. "You can't be FAA. You're just a passenger. You're wearing a hoodie. You paid cash. You don't look like..." The sentence died in Derek's throat as he realized that finishing it would only provide additional evidence of the discriminatory thinking that had already destroyed his career. But David Washington completed the thought for him with the kind of calm precision that came from years of investigating exactly these types of incidents. "I don't look like what Captain Morrison," David asked, rising from his seat with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years commanding respect in difficult situations. "I don't look like someone who could have the authority to ground your aircraft and suspend your license. I don't look like someone who could have earned a position of responsibility in federal aviation safety, or I don't look like someone who belongs in first class." Senator Patricia Williams stood up from her seat and won. her movement drawing attention to the fact that one of the most powerful members of the Senate Transportation Committee had just witnessed an FAA director being subjected to blatant racial discrimination by a commercial airline pilot. "Captain Morrison," the senator said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she normally reserved for congressional hearings. "I believe you owe Director Washington an immediate apology, though I suspect that's the least of your concerns at this point." Derek's training and experience told him to attempt damage control to try to explain his actions in terms of legitimate security procedures and passenger safety protocols. But the evidence of his discriminatory behavior had been captured by multiple passengers on their phones and witnessed by some of the most influential people in American politics and business. His desperate attempt to maintain authority had instead created an undeniable record of bias that no amount of explanation could rationalize away. "Director Washington, there's been a misunderstanding." Derek began, his voice shaking as he tried to salvage something from the wreckage of his career. "My concerns were based on legitimate security protocols, not on any personal prejudices. The cash payment, the last-minute booking, the lack of corporate travel history. These are all red flags that any responsible captain would investigate thoroughly." David Washington studied Derek with the kind of professional detachment that came from years of conducting federal investigations, and his response carried the weight of official authority rather than personal anger. "Captain Morrison, I have been conducting undercover audits of airline discrimination practices for the past 18 months. And this conversation has provided some of the clearest evidence of bias-based passenger treatment that my office has ever documented. Your actions today were not based on security concerns, and we both know it." Linda Martinez had retreated to the galley area where she was frantically making phone calls to notify airline management about the federal incident that was unfolding on their aircraft, while Kevin Chen had emerged from the cockpit with the confused expression of someone trying to understand how a routine flight had suddenly become a career-ending crisis for his captain. The other passengers were maintaining a respectful silence, but the constant glow of phone cameras made it clear that every word and gesture was being recorded for posterity. "Sir," Derek said, making one final attempt to assert some measure of control over the situation, "regardless of your position with the FAA, you were traveling under false pretenses and using deceptive identification. How was I supposed to know who you really were when you were deliberately concealing your identity? Any reasonable person would have been suspicious of a passenger who wasn't being honest about their background." David Washington pulled out his small notebook and made another entry while Derek watched, understanding that his words were being documented for use in what would undoubtedly be a lengthy federal investigation. "Captain Morrison traveling in casual clothes while carrying proper identification is not traveling under false pretenses," David replied, his tone remaining professional despite the gravity of the situation. "More importantly, even if I had been exactly who you thought I was, a young black man who somehow managed to afford a first-class ticket, that would not have justified the discriminatory treatment you subjected me to." The phrase, "young black man," seemed to hang in the air as Derek finally heard his own prejudices reflected back to him, and the shame of recognition was almost as devastating as the professional consequences he was facing. For the first time since the confrontation began, Derek Morrison was forced to confront the ugly reality of what his actions had revealed about his character and his fitness to serve as a commercial airline pilot. Airport security personnel were already boarding the aircraft summoned by Linda's emergency communications with the ground crew, and Derek understood that his next conversation would be with federal investigators rather than airline management. As he watched David Washington calmly organizing his documentation and preparing for what would clearly be an extensive debriefing process, Derek Morrison realized that his 20-year career in commercial aviation had ended not with mechanical failure or weather emergency, but with his own inability to see past the color of a passenger's skin. The storm clouds outside the aircraft windows seemed almost peaceful compared to the institutional hurricane that Derek's prejudices had unleashed, and as airport security officers approached to begin the formal documentation of the incident, Derek Morrison finally understood that some mistakes cannot be undone and some words cannot be taken back. The arrival of airport security transformed Flight 847 from a delayed departure into a federal crime scene as two uniformed officers made their way through the aircraft's narrow aisle, while passengers remained in their seats with the kind of tense attention that comes from witnessing history in the making. Derek Morrison stood frozen near seat 2. B. His captain's uniform no longer a symbol of authority, but evidence of how badly someone in a position of trust could abuse their power. Sergeant Michael Torres, the senior security officer, approached the situation with the careful professionalism of someone who understood that incidents involving federal officials required extreme precision and documentation. His partner, Officer Rebecca Kim, immediately began taking photographs of the cabin layout and passenger positions, while Torres focused on identifying the key participants in what was clearly a significant federal incident. "I'm Sergeant Torres with Airport Security," he announced, addressing both Derek and David with equal formality. "We've received reports of a passenger discrimination incident involving federal personnel. I need to establish the basic facts before we proceed with any further action." David Washington presented his FAA credentials with the same calm efficiency he had maintained throughout Derek's increasingly aggressive interrogation, and Torres examined the federal identification with the respectful attention that came from years of working in an environment where federal authorities commanded immediate respect. "Director Washington, can you briefly describe what occurred during your interaction with the flight crew?" Sergeant Torres: "I was subjected to repeated identity verification requests, intrusive questioning about my payment methods and travel purposes, and ultimately threatened with removal from my paid seat based solely on the captain's assumptions about my appearance and suitability for first-class seating." David replied his statement carrying the precise language of someone accustomed to providing testimony in legal proceedings. "The incident escalated when I refused to comply with Captain Morrison's demand that I move to economy class, at which point he made explicitly discriminatory statements about where I belong." Derek felt compelled to offer his version of events, though his voice lacked the confidence and authority that had characterized his behavior throughout his career. "Sergeant Torres, I want to be clear that my actions were based on legitimate security concerns about unusual passenger behavior and documentation irregularities," Derek said, though he could hear how weak his justification sounded when spoken aloud. "As captain of this aircraft, I have both the authority and the responsibility to investigate anything that might pose a risk to passenger safety or comfort." Sergeant Torres had handled enough discrimination complaints to recognize the standard defenses that people offered when caught engaging in biased behavior, and Derek's explanation sounded exactly like the rationalization attempts that preceded federal civil rights charges. "Captain Morrison, can you explain why Director Washington's presence required multiple identity checks when other passengers in first class weren't subjected to the same level of scrutiny?" The question cut directly to the heart of Derek's discriminatory treatment, and his inability to provide a coherent answer that didn't rely on racial assumptions became obvious to everyone in the cabin. Derek looked around desperately for support or understanding from the passengers who had witnessed the confrontation, but found only expressions of disappointment and judgment from people who had seen him reveal his true character under pressure. Senator Williams approached Sergeant Torres with the measured authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in high-stakes situations. "Sergeant, I'm Patricia Williams, and I've observed this entire incident from beginning to end," she said, producing her Senate identification. "I can confirm that Director Washington behaved professionally throughout the confrontation, while Captain Morrison's actions became increasingly discriminatory and aggressive without any justifiable cause." The weight of having a sitting senator serve as a witness to federal discrimination charges made Derek's situation exponentially worse, and he understood that his case would now be handled at the highest levels of federal law enforcement rather than through airline internal disciplinary procedures. The prospect of facing criminal charges rather than just losing his job created a new level of panic that Derek struggled to contain. James Sullivan also stepped forward to provide his account of the incident, his testimony carrying additional authority because of his prominence in the technology industry and his reputation for objectivity in business matters. "Officers, I recorded portions of the confrontation on my phone because it was clear that Captain Morrison was engaging in discriminatory behavior," Sullivan said, holding up his device. "The video clearly shows that Director Washington was calm and professional, while the captain became increasingly aggressive and made explicitly biased statements." The existence of video evidence eliminated any possibility that Derek might be able to claim the incident had been misunderstood or taken out of context, and the prospect of having his discriminatory behavior broadcast nationally made him realize that his personal humiliation would be just as devastating as his professional destruction. Derek Morrison, who had spent his entire career building a reputation for excellence and reliability, would now be remembered as the pilot who racially profiled an FAA director. As Sergeant Torres completed his preliminary interviews and began the process of formally documenting the federal incident, Derek Morrison stood in the aisle of his own aircraft and watched his life disintegrate around him. The security investigation, the media attention, the civil rights lawsuit, and the criminal charges would all follow in due course. But in that moment of truth, Derek finally understood that his prejudices had not only destroyed his career, but had revealed a fundamental flaw in his character that no amount of professional success could excuse or overcome. Within 30 minutes of David Washington revealing his federal credentials, Flight 847 had been officially grounded by the Federal Aviation Administration pending a comprehensive investigation of discriminatory practices, transforming what should have been a routine commercial flight into a federal incident that would reverberate through the airline industry for years to come. Derek Morrison sat in an airport security office watching his career evaporate in real time as federal investigators, airline executives, and civil rights attorneys descended upon Chicago O'Hare like a legal hurricane that would reshape aviation employment policies. Special Agent Maria Santos from the FBI's Civil Rights Division had driven directly from downtown Chicago upon receiving notification that a federal discrimination case was unfolding at one of the nation's busiest airports, and her arrival signaled that Derek's situation had moved far beyond airline disciplinary procedures into the realm of potential federal criminal charges. Agent Santos was a 15-year veteran of investigating bias crimes who had seen every possible variation of institutional discrimination. But the combination of video evidence, federal victim status, and witness testimony from a sitting senator made this case uniquely prosecutable. "Captain Morrison, I'm Special Agent Santos with the FBI," she announced as she entered the security office where Derek sat with his union representative and a hastily summoned attorney. "You are not under arrest at this time, but I need to inform you that you are the subject of a federal civil rights investigation related to your treatment of Director Washington aboard Flight 847. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in federal court." Derek's attorney, Michael Brennan, was a Chicago-based lawyer who specialized in airline employment cases but had never dealt with federal discrimination charges involving FAA officials. "Agent Santos, my client maintains that his actions were based on legitimate security concerns and established airline protocols for verifying passenger documentation," Brennan said, though his voice lacked conviction, and his expression suggested he understood how weak Derek's defense would be in federal court. "And Mr. Brennan, we have video evidence of your client making explicitly discriminatory statements, witness testimony from multiple passengers, including a United States senator, and documentation from Director Washington's official undercover investigation," Agent Santos replied, opening a thick file folder that contained preliminary reports from the incident. "This is not a case that hinges on interpretation of motives or disputed facts. Your client's own words provide clear evidence of bias-based treatment that violates multiple federal statutes." Meanwhile, in a conference room elsewhere in the airport, David Washington was providing detailed testimony to federal investigators while simultaneously coordinating with FAA administrators in Washington, D.C. about the immediate regulatory response to the incident. His years of experience conducting aviation safety investigations had taught him the importance of thorough documentation, and the discrimination he had experienced would become a case study in how individual prejudices could compromise the integrity of the entire commercial aviation system. Director Washington, can you walk us through the specific moments when Captain Morrison's behavior crossed from inappropriate to illegal? Asked Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Cole, who had been assigned to prosecute the case due to her expertise in federal civil rights law. I need precise details about his statements and actions that demonstrate discriminatory intent rather than legitimate security concerns. David consulted his handwritten notes from the flight, the same small notebook that Derek had dismissed as suspicious behavior earlier that day. The turning point came when Captain Morrison demanded that I move to economy class where I belong, which was an explicitly discriminatory statement that revealed his true motivations. David explained, "Everything prior to that moment could potentially be rationalized as overzealous security procedures, but that phrase eliminated any ambiguity about his intent." The viral spread of passenger-recorded videos across social media platforms had already made Derek Morrison a national symbol of discrimination in commercial aviation, with #racistpilot trending on Twitter and major news outlets preparing comprehensive reports about bias in airline operations. The public relations disaster for Derek's employer, United Airlines, required immediate damage control efforts that included suspending Derek without pay and issuing public statements condemning discriminatory behavior by any employee. Derek's ex-wife Sarah called his cell phone repeatedly as news of the incident reached their hometown, but Derek couldn't bring himself to answer and explain how his prejudices had destroyed not just his career, but any hope of maintaining a relationship with his teenage daughter Emma. The viral videos would ensure that Emma's classmates would see her father's discriminatory behavior, creating a legacy of shame that would follow their family for years to come. Back at the airport, Senator Patricia Williams was providing her own statement to federal investigators while coordinating with her staff about the legislative response that would be needed to prevent similar incidents in the future. As chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, Senator Williams had both the authority and the responsibility to ensure that Derek Morrison's actions triggered comprehensive reforms in airline training and oversight procedures. This incident represents a systemic failure in how airlines train their personnel to recognize and prevent discriminatory behavior, Senator Williams told the gathered investigators and media representatives. Director Washington was subjected to treatment that would be unacceptable for any passenger, but the fact that it happened to a federal aviation official demonstrates how widespread these problems have become in commercial aviation. The word systemic was carefully chosen to signal that the investigation would extend beyond Derek Morrison's individual actions to examine whether United Airlines and other carriers had created cultures that enabled or encouraged discriminatory treatment of passengers based on race appearance or perceived social status. The prospect of industry-wide federal oversight made Derek's case a catalyst for changes that would affect millions of travelers and thousands of airline employees. As Derek Morrison sat in the airport security office watching news coverage of his own downfall, he finally began to understand the magnitude of what his prejudices had set in motion. The federal investigation, the media attention, the civil rights lawsuit, and the criminal charges were just the beginning of consequences that would reshape not only his own life, but the entire commercial aviation industry's approach to passenger treatment and bias prevention. The FBI's investigation into Derek Morrison's discriminatory behavior expanded rapidly from a single incident review into a comprehensive audit of his entire career, as federal investigators discovered a pattern of passenger removals and complaints that painted a disturbing picture of institutionalized bias disguised as professional aviation judgment. Special Agent Santos and her team spent 3 days reviewing 20 years of Derek's flight records, passenger complaints, and crew reports, uncovering evidence that the confrontation with David Washington was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of discriminatory practices that had been overlooked or ignored by airline management. Agent Santos, we've identified 17 separate incidents over the past 5 years where Captain Morrison removed passengers from first-class seating. Reported FBI data analyst Kevin Park scrolling through airline databases that contain detailed records of every passenger complaint and crew action report. What's particularly troubling is that every single passenger who was removed was either Black Hispanic or appeared to be of Middle Eastern descent, while the official reports consistently cited security concerns or disruptive behavior as justification. The statistical impossibility of such a pattern occurring by random chance provided compelling evidence that Derek had been systematically targeting minority passengers who didn't match his preconceptions about who belonged in premium cabin seating, and the careful documentation in airline computer systems created an undeniable paper trail that would be devastating in federal court. Agent Santos recognized that this level of documented discrimination was rare in civil rights cases, where prosecutors typically had to rely on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony rather than comprehensive data analysis. United Airlines executives were conducting their own internal investigation while simultaneously preparing for the massive legal liability that Derek's actions had created for the company, as federal regulations held airlines responsible for discriminatory behavior by their employees, regardless of whether management was aware of specific incidents. Corporate attorney Elizabeth Chen was coordinating with multiple law firms about the class action lawsuits that would inevitably follow as the removed passengers learned about the pattern of discrimination they had experienced. We're looking at potentially tens of millions in civil damages, plus federal fines that could reach into the hundreds of millions, Chen informed United's board of directors during an emergency meeting called to address the crisis. The fact that Captain Morrison's behavior was documented over multiple years while he received positive performance reviews suggests institutional negligence that will be very difficult to defend in federal court. The revelation that Derek had received consistently excellent performance evaluations despite engaging in discriminatory behavior raised serious questions about United's oversight procedures and management accountability that extended far beyond the actions of a single pilot. Federal investigators began examining whether Derek's supervisors had been aware of passenger complaints about his behavior and had chosen to ignore them rather than address potential civil rights violations. Derek's union representative, Tom Matthews from the Airline Pilots Association, found himself in the impossible position of trying to defend a member whose actions were clearly indefensible while protecting the broader interests of pilots who might face increased federal scrutiny as a result of Derek's behavior. We condemn any form of discrimination by our members, but we also need to ensure that federal investigators don't use this incident to undermine legitimate pilot authority and safety procedures, Matthews said in a carefully worded statement that satisfied no one. The passenger videos of Derek's confrontation with David Washington had been viewed millions of times across social media platforms, creating a level of public outrage that made political action inevitable and ensuring that Derek's case would become a catalyst for legislative changes in aviation policy. Civil rights organizations called for comprehensive reforms in airline training procedures, while aviation industry groups warned that excessive federal oversight could compromise flight safety by making pilots afraid to make necessary security decisions. Derek Morrison sat in his empty suburban home, officially suspended from all flight duties and facing criminal charges that could result in years in federal prison while watching news coverage that portrayed him as a symbol of everything wrong with institutional racism in American transportation systems. His attempts to contact his daughter Emma had been unsuccessful, as his ex-wife Sarah had decided that their children didn't need to be exposed to the media attention surrounding their father's disgrace. The financial implications of Derek's situation were becoming clear as his attorney explained that federal civil rights violations could result in personal liability that wouldn't be covered by airline insurance policies, potentially leaving Derek responsible for millions of dollars in damages to the passengers he had discriminated against over the years. The house, the car, the retirement savings, and even his military pension could all be seized to pay civil judgments that might exceed his lifetime earning capacity. Derek's elderly parents, who had been proud of their son's career in commercial aviation, struggled to understand how the boy they had raised to treat everyone with respect had become a national symbol of prejudice and discrimination. Colonel James Morrison, Derek's father, called from the assisted living facility where he and Derek's mother now lived to ask questions that Derek couldn't answer about how his values had become so corrupted by fear and resentment. As federal investigators expanded their examination of Derek's behavior to include interviews with former colleagues, flight attendants, and passengers who had experienced his discriminatory treatment, the scope of the case continued to grow beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. The confrontation with David Washington had exposed not just individual prejudice, but institutional failures that would require comprehensive reform of airline training oversight and accountability procedures. The unraveling of Derek Morrison's career and reputation was complete, but the broader implications of his actions were just beginning to emerge as federal authorities prepared to use his case as a foundation for transforming how the entire commercial aviation industry approached civil rights compliance and bias prevention. Derek Morrison sat alone in the living room of his suburban home at 3:17 a.m., surrounded by the wreckage of a life that had imploded so completely that he could barely remember who he had been before the confrontation with David Washington transformed him from a respected pilot into a national symbol of discrimination and prejudice. The house felt cavernous and hostile, filled with furniture and photographs that belonged to a man Derek no longer recognized, while news vans parked outside ensured that his humiliation would remain public and permanent. Sleep had become impossible since the FBI began their investigation 3 weeks earlier, replaced by endless cycles of replaying every moment of the encounter that had destroyed his career, and wondering how he had become the kind of person who could look at a fellow human being and see only stereotypes and assumptions. Derek had always thought of himself as a good man, someone who treated people fairly regardless of their background, but the viral videos of his behavior toward David Washington revealed a truth about his character that was almost too painful to acknowledge. The text message from his daughter Emma had arrived just after midnight, brief and devastating. "Dad, I saw the videos. How could you say those things? I'm embarrassed to have your name. Don't call me until you figure out how to be better." Derek had read the message dozens of times, each repetition driving the knife of shame deeper into his conscience as he confronted the reality that his prejudices had not only destroyed his career, but had also cost him the relationship with the person who mattered most in his life. Derek walked to the kitchen and made coffee with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion and stress, then sat at the table where he and Sarah used to read the newspaper together before their marriage fell apart under the weight of his increasing anger and resentment about everything that seemed to be going wrong in his life. The divorce, the financial pressure, the fear of losing his position in an industry that was becoming more competitive every year. All of these factors had created a perfect storm of desperation that somehow transformed into prejudice against people who had done nothing to harm him. The manila folder containing legal documents sat unopened on the kitchen counter, filled with federal charges and civil lawsuits that Derek's attorney had tried to explain, but which seemed too overwhelming to process completely. 23 separate counts of civil rights violations, a class action lawsuit representing 17 passengers who had been removed from flights over the past 5 years, and personal liability that could exceed $10 million in damages and fines. Derek Morrison, who had once been proud of his financial responsibility and professional success, now faced bankruptcy and potential imprisonment because he had been unable to see past the color of David Washington's skin. His phone rang with a call from his father, and Derek answered with the dread of someone who knew that every conversation now required explanations for behavior that had no reasonable explanation. "Son, I've been thinking about what happened, and I need to ask you something," Colonel Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of disappointment rather than anger. "When you were growing up, did your mother and I ever teach you that some people were worth less than others because of how they looked or where they came from?" "No, Dad." Derek whispered the simple question, cutting through every rationalization he had tried to construct about his behavior. "You taught me that everyone deserved respect and dignity regardless of their background. You fought in Korea alongside men of every race and ethnicity, and you never spoke about anyone as if they were less than human. Then help me understand how my son became someone who could look at a man in a hoodie and decide he didn't belong in first class." Colonel Morrison continued, his military bearing evident even over the phone. "Help me understand how a pilot I was proud of became someone who would humiliate another person based on assumptions and prejudices that have no place in a civilized society." Derek couldn't answer immediately because he was finally confronting the uncomfortable truth that his father's questions demanded somewhere along the way. His fears and frustrations had metastasized into a toxic worldview that divided people into categories of worthy and unworthy based on appearance, clothing, and race. The gradual erosion of his values had been so slow and subtle that Derek hadn't recognized what was happening until David Washington's federal badge forced him to see himself clearly for the first time in years. "Dad, I don't know how it happened," Derek admitted, his voice breaking as he acknowledged the magnitude of his failure. "I think I was so angry about everything that was going wrong in my life that I started looking for someone to blame. And somehow that turned into blaming people who didn't look like me or talk like me or dress like me. I became someone I never wanted to be, and I hurt innocent people because I was too weak and scared to deal with my own problems." The conversation with his father continued for nearly an hour, with Derek slowly beginning to articulate thoughts and feelings that he had been suppressing for months out of shame and denial. The financial pressure, the divorce, the fear of professional failure, all of these legitimate concerns had somehow been twisted into resentment toward people who had nothing to do with Derek's problems but who served as convenient targets for his displaced anger and frustration. As dawn broke over the Chicago suburbs, Derek Morrison finally began the painful process of honest self-examination that should have happened years earlier before his prejudices destroyed his career and hurt innocent people who had done nothing to deserve his discriminatory treatment. The federal investigation would continue, the criminal charges would proceed, and the civil lawsuits would determine his financial future. But for the first time since the confrontation with David Washington, Derek was finally ready to confront the man he had become and begin the long, difficult work of figuring out how to become someone better. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago was surrounded by news vans and protesters from civil rights organizations as Derek Morrison arrived for his formal sentencing hearing, 6 months after the confrontation that had transformed him from a respected commercial pilot into a convicted felon whose case would be studied in law schools and aviation training programs for decades to come. Derek walked through the gauntlet of cameras and questions wearing a simple gray suit rather than his pilot's uniform. His shoulders hunched with the weight of shame and the knowledge that this day would mark the end of one chapter of his life and the uncertain beginning of another. Federal Judge Patricia Hernandez had presided over dozens of civil rights cases during her 15 years on the bench, but the combination of video evidence, pattern documentation, and high-profile victim status made Derek's case one of the most clear-cut examples of institutional discrimination she had ever encountered. The prosecution had presented overwhelming evidence that Derek had systematically targeted minority passengers over a period of years, while his defense attorney had been reduced to arguing for leniency based on Derek's previously clean record and expressions of remorse. "Mr. Morrison, please rise for sentencing," Judge Hernandez announced as the packed courtroom fell silent. Derek stood beside his attorney, Michael Brennan, while David Washington sat in the front row with the 17 other passengers who had been victims of Derek's discriminatory behavior over the past 5 years. The diversity of the victim group, successful professionals, students, military veterans, and business travelers from every walk of life made it impossible to rationalize Derek's actions as anything other than pure prejudice. The evidence presented in this case demonstrates a pattern of discriminatory behavior that strikes at the heart of our civil rights protections and our fundamental belief in equal treatment under law. Judge Hernandez continued consulting the sentencing documents that detailed Derek's crimes and their impact on his victims. Your actions, Mr. Morrison, violated not only federal law, but the basic human dignity of passengers who trusted you with their safety and expected to be treated with respect regardless of their appearance or background. Derek had spent the past 6 months in court-mandated counseling and bias training working with psychologists and civil rights educators to understand how his fears and frustrations had metastasized into systematic discrimination against people who had done nothing to harm him. The process had been painful and humbling, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his character and the assumptions that had guided his behavior for years without his conscious awareness. Your Honor, I want to acknowledge the harm I caused to Director Washington and the other passengers I discriminated against, Derek said when given the opportunity to address the court. I have no excuse for my behavior, which was based on prejudices and assumptions that I should have recognized and rejected. I failed in my duty as a pilot, as a public servant, and as a human being, and I accept full responsibility for the consequences of my actions. David Washington had chosen to attend the sentencing hearing, not out of vindictiveness, but because he believed that accountability was an essential component of any meaningful attempt at reconciliation and reform. His victim impact statement had focused less on Derek's personal failings and more on the broader institutional changes that needed to emerge from this case to prevent similar incidents in the future. Director Washington, would you like to address the court regarding the impact of Mr. Morrison's crimes? Judge Hernandez asked, giving David an opportunity to speak directly to the man who had subjected him to discriminatory treatment. David stood and faced Derek directly, his expression reflecting neither anger nor forgiveness, but the kind of professional gravity that came from years of investigating aviation safety violations. Your Honor, Captain Morrison's actions represent a failure of individual character, but they also reveal institutional problems that extend beyond any single person or incident, David said. My hope is that this case will serve as a catalyst for comprehensive reforms in airline training and oversight that will protect all passengers from discriminatory treatment. Judge Hernandez sentenced Derek to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation and community service focused on civil rights education, while the civil lawsuits filed by his victims would continue separately and likely result in financial damages that would affect Derek for the rest of his life. The criminal sentence was significant enough to serve as a deterrent to others who might consider engaging in similar behavior, while the civil penalties would ensure that Derek's discriminatory actions had lasting personal consequences. United Airlines had already implemented comprehensive policy changes inspired by Derek's case, including mandatory bias training for all crew members, passenger advocate programs to address discrimination complaints, and federal oversight requirements that would prevent similar patterns of discriminatory behavior from going undetected in the future. The Morrison Protocols, as they became known in aviation circles, represented the most significant civil rights reforms in commercial aviation since the industry's deregulation in the 1970s. As Derek Morrison was led away to begin his federal prison sentence, he carried with him letters from several of his victims who had chosen to forgive him despite the harm he had caused, understanding that genuine accountability required acknowledgement of wrongdoing, followed by sincere efforts at personal transformation. The work of becoming a better person would continue long after Derek served his sentence. But for the first time in years, he had a clear understanding of what that work would require and why it mattered for everyone whose lives he might touch in the future. The accountability phase of Derek Morrison's journey was complete. But the redemption phase was just beginning, offering hope that even someone who had failed as dramatically as Derek could still find ways to contribute positively to a society that desperately needed examples of people learning from their mistakes and working to repair the damage they had caused. The minimum security federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, was not the kind of place Derek Morrison had ever imagined himself spending 18 months of his life. But the court-mandated bias sensitivity program had given him an unexpected opportunity to begin the difficult work of understanding how his prejudices had developed and learning how to become a genuinely better person. Derek's cellmate was Marcus Williams, a former corporate executive who was serving time for securities fraud and who had spent his pre-prison career working with diversity and inclusion programs at major corporations. "The thing about bias training in here," Marcus explained during one of their evening conversations in the small cell they shared, "is that you can't fake your way through it like you might in some corporate program. The counselors and the other participants can see right through any attempt to just say what you think they want to hear, because everyone here has done something that revealed their true character under pressure." Derek had initially approached the prison's bias education program with the cynical expectation that it would be a superficial exercise in political correctness. But Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the program director, had quickly disabused him of that notion by requiring participants to engage in brutally honest self-examination and direct conversations with people from the communities they had harmed. The weekly group sessions forced Derek to confront other inmates who had committed hate crimes, employment discrimination, and housing violations, creating a microcosm of the larger society that Derek would need to navigate upon his release. "Derek, I want you to tell the group about the moment when you realized that David Washington's appearance triggered assumptions in your mind that had nothing to do with legitimate security concerns," Dr. Martinez said during a Thursday morning session that included 8 other federal inmates convicted of various civil rights violations. The question was designed to force Derek to articulate the specific thought processes that had led to his discriminatory behavior, rather than hiding behind vague expressions of regret. "When I first saw Director Washington in seat 2B, my immediate reaction was that he looked out of place among the business travelers and politicians who usually occupy first class." Derek admitted, his voice carrying the shame of someone finally acknowledging an ugly truth about himself. "I didn't see a successful professional who could afford an expensive ticket. I saw a black man in casual clothes and assumed he didn't belong there, which led me to look for reasons to justify removing him from a space I thought should be reserved for people who looked like me." The group sessions were supplemented by individual counseling that required Derek to examine the personal and professional pressures that had made him susceptible to discriminatory thinking, while letter-writing exercises forced him to communicate directly with David Washington and the other passengers he had wronged over the years. Some of his victims had responded with forgiveness and encouragement, while others had expressed continued anger and hurt that reminded Derek of the lasting impact his actions had on real people's lives. Derek's relationship with his daughter Emma had begun to slowly heal through weekly phone calls and letters that documented his progress in the bias training program. Though Emma made it clear that their relationship would depend on Derek's ability to demonstrate genuine change, rather than simply serving his time and returning to his old patterns of thinking. "Dad, I need to see that you understand why what you did was wrong, not just that you're sorry you got caught," Emma had written in her most recent letter. "I want to be proud of you again, but that's going to require you to become someone who deserves that pride." The prison library became Derek's refuge during the long hours when he wasn't participating in formal programs, and he spent hundreds of hours reading books about civil rights history, unconscious bias, and the experiences of people who had overcome their own prejudices to become advocates for justice and equality. The autobiography of a former Ku Klux Klan member who had renounced his racist beliefs and spent decades fighting for civil rights became particularly meaningful to Derek as an example of someone who had transformed from perpetrator to advocate. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, David Washington had been promoted to deputy administrator of the FAA, where his primary responsibility was implementing the comprehensive bias prevention programs that had emerged from Derek's case and similar incidents across the transportation industry. The Morrison protocols had been adopted by every major airline in the United States, creating standardized training requirements and accountability measures that were already reducing passenger discrimination complaints by significant percentages. "The goal isn't just to punish people like Derek Morrison," David explained during a conference presentation about aviation civil rights reforms. "The goal is to create institutional cultures and individual awareness that prevent discrimination from happening in the first place, while providing clear pathways for accountability and redemption when failures do occur." The transformation programs that Derek was experiencing in federal prison were being replicated in airline training centers across the country, where pilots, flight attendants, and ground personnel were learning to recognize and interrupt their own biased thinking before it could harm passengers or colleagues. Derek's case had become a cautionary tale that illustrated the personal and professional consequences of discriminatory behavior, while his documented rehabilitation process offered hope that people could change if they were willing to do the difficult work of honest self-examination. As Derek approached the halfway point of his federal sentence, he had begun volunteering to facilitate bias awareness sessions for new inmates, sharing his story as an example of how successful professionals could still harbor dangerous prejudices that destroyed their careers and hurt innocent people. The work was painful and humbling, but it also provided Derek with a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life long before the confrontation with David Washington had exposed his character flaws to the world. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning 18 months after Derek Morrison's sentencing, hand-delivered to the federal prison in Terre Haute by a courier who waited for Derek's carefully handwritten response before returning to the airport for the flight back to Washington, D.C. The envelope bore the official seal of the Federal Aviation Administration, and Derek's hands trembled slightly as he opened correspondence from the man whose life he had tried to destroy based on nothing more than prejudice and assumptions. "Mr. Morrison." The letter began using the formal address that acknowledged Derek's loss of his pilot credentials while maintaining basic human dignity. "I have been following reports of your participation in the bias education program and your volunteer work with other inmates who are confronting their own discriminatory behavior. While I cannot and will not minimize the harm your actions caused to me and the other passengers you targeted over the years, I believe that genuine accountability requires acknowledgement of progress as well as punishment for failures." Derek read the letter multiple times in his cell, struggling to process David Washington's measured tone and the unexpected offer to meet in person once Derek completed his federal sentence. The possibility of facing the man he had wronged so badly filled Derek with a mixture of anticipation and terror. But Dr. Martinez had prepared him for this moment through months of counseling about accountability, forgiveness, and the difference between seeking absolution and taking responsibility for change. 2 weeks before Derek's scheduled release, his daughter Emma visited the prison for the first time since his conviction, carrying a worn copy of Derek's grandfather's military service records and a letter of acceptance to law school that she had decided to pursue after watching her father's case unfold in federal court. The reunion was emotional and complicated, marked by tentative affection mixed with the reality that their relationship would need to be rebuilt based on Derek's demonstrated commitment to being different than the man who had humiliated her with his discriminatory behavior. "Dad, I've been accepted to Northwestern's Civil Rights Law program," Emma announced during their conversation in the prison visiting room, her voice carrying pride mixed with wariness about how Derek would respond to her career choice. "I decided that if my father was going to be known for discrimination, maybe his daughter could be known for fighting against it." Derek felt overwhelming pride in Emma's strength and moral clarity, even as he recognized that his failures had shaped her life choices in ways that would have lasting consequences for both of them. "Emma, I'm proud of you for choosing a path that will help people who've experienced what Director Washington and the others went through because of my prejudices. Derek replied, his voice thick with emotion. I know I can't undo the embarrassment I caused you, but maybe I can spend the rest of my life trying to earn back your respect. The day of Derek's release from federal prison was deliberately low-key, with no media attention or family fanfare, just a quiet transition from institutional supervision to the beginning of his probation period and community service obligations. Derek's first stop was the halfway house in Chicago, where he would live for 6 months while completing his transition back to civilian life, followed by an appointment with his probation officer, who would monitor his compliance with court-ordered bias training and community service requirements. Derek's required community service involved speaking at high schools, police departments, and corporate training seminars about the personal and professional consequences of discriminatory behavior, sharing his story as an example of how bias could destroy careers and hurt innocent people, while offering hope that change was possible for anyone willing to do the difficult work of honest self-examination. The speaking engagements were challenging and often hostile, as Derek faced audiences who viewed him as a symbol of institutional racism rather than as a human being trying to make amends for past failures. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or to minimize the harm I caused. Derek would begin each presentation his standard opening designed to acknowledge the reality of his crimes while establishing credibility for the educational message that followed. I'm here to share my story as evidence that successful educated people can still harbor dangerous prejudices that hurt others and destroy their own lives, and to demonstrate that change is possible if you're willing to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself. The presentation at Chicago's South Side Community Center was particularly meaningful because several of Derek's former victims attended to hear his account of the bias training he had completed and the changes he claimed to have made in his thinking and behavior. The questions from the audience were challenging and skeptical, but Derek answered them honestly without defensiveness, understanding that his credibility would be determined by his responses to criticism rather than by his prepared remarks. David Washington attended one of Derek's community presentations not to confront him publicly, but to observe whether Derek's transformation appeared genuine or merely performed for the sake of reducing his legal obligations. After the presentation concluded, David approached Derek privately to suggest the personal meeting that both men understood would be necessary for any meaningful closure to their shared experience. Mr. Morrison, I'd like to have a conversation about what happened between us and what you've learned since then. David said, his tone professional but not hostile. Not for forgiveness or absolution, but because I think both of us need to understand how someone like you became someone like me and whether that understanding can help prevent similar incidents in the future. And the meeting was scheduled for the following month at a neutral location, giving both men time to prepare for a conversation that would determine whether Derek's redemption journey was genuine or whether his bias training had simply taught him to articulate the right words without achieving real change. For Derek, the upcoming meeting represented the ultimate test of whether he had truly learned to see David Washington as a fellow human being, deserving of respect, rather than as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in his own life. The coffee shop in downtown Chicago was deliberately ordinary, the kind of place where two men could have a difficult conversation without drawing attention from curious observers or media representatives who might turn a private moment of accountability into a public spectacle. Derek Morrison arrived 15 minutes early, his hands shaking slightly as he ordered black coffee, and found a corner table where he could watch David Washington enter while mentally preparing for the most important conversation of his life. When David walked through the door exactly on time, Derek felt the familiar mixture of shame and recognition that had characterized his response to seeing the man whose life he had tried to disrupt based on nothing more than prejudice and assumptions about who belonged in first-class seating. But David's expression carried no anger or hostility, just the kind of professional gravity that Derek remembered from their confrontation on Flight 847, along with something new that might have been cautious respect for the work Derek had done during his imprisonment. Mr. Morrison, David said, settling into the chair across from Derek with the measured movements of someone who understood the significance of this moment. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I want to be clear about my expectations for this conversation. I'm not here to offer forgiveness or to help you feel better about what you did. I'm here because I believe that understanding how good people can do terrible things is essential for preventing similar incidents in the future." Derek nodded, understanding that David's willingness to meet with him was an act of professional duty rather than personal absolution, and that any redemption he might achieve would need to come from his own commitment to change rather than from external validation. "Director Washington, I appreciate you being willing to have this conversation, and I want you to know that I don't expect or deserve forgiveness for the way I treated you and the other passengers I discriminated against over the years." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 3 hours, with David asking probing questions about Derek's thought processes during their original confrontation, and Derek providing honest answers about the fears, frustrations, and prejudices that had led him to see David's appearance as a threat to his authority rather than recognizing him as a fellow professional deserving of respect. The discussion was painful and uncomfortable, but it was also productive in ways that surprised both men. "What I need to understand," David said at one point, "is how a pilot with 20 years of experience and a previously clean record could look at me sitting quietly in my assigned seat and decide that I represented some kind of security threat. Help me understand what was going through your mind when you first saw me in first class." Derek took a deep breath and forced himself to articulate thoughts that he had spent months examining in therapy and bias training sessions. "When I saw you in seat 2B, my immediate reaction was that you didn't fit my mental image of who belonged in first class," Derek admitted. "I had spent years flying VIP passengers who looked and dressed in predictable ways, and your appearance challenged my assumptions about success, wealth, and social status. Instead of questioning those assumptions, I looked for reasons to justify removing you from a space I thought should be reserved for people who looked like me." David listened without interruption as Derek described the personal and professional pressures that had made him susceptible to discriminatory thinking, the gradual erosion of values that had occurred so slowly that Derek hadn't recognized what was happening until federal charges forced him to confront his behavior. The explanation didn't excuse Derek's actions, but it provided insight into how bias could infect the thinking of people who considered themselves fair and professional. "The thing that troubles me most," Derek continued, "is that I genuinely believed I was protecting my other passengers and maintaining professional standards, when what I was really doing was enforcing my own prejudices about who deserved respect and accommodation. I turned you into a symbol of everything I was afraid of losing, instead of seeing you as an individual human being with the same rights and dignity as anyone else on that plane." David studied Derek's face carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or performance, but finding instead the kind of painful honesty that suggested genuine self-awareness, rather than calculated attempts at impression management. The Derek Morrison sitting across from him was clearly different from the angry defensive pilot who had tried to remove him from Flight 847, though David understood that real change would need to be demonstrated through sustained behavior rather than through a single conversation. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to know that your case has resulted in significant reforms in aviation civil rights enforcement," David said, shifting the conversation toward the broader implications of their encounter. "The Morrison protocols have been implemented across the industry, and we're seeing measurable reductions in passenger discrimination complaints as a result of the training programs and accountability measures that emerged from your case." Derek felt a complex mixture of pride and shame as he learned that his failures had contributed to positive changes that would protect other passengers from experiencing the discrimination he had inflicted on David and others. "Director Washington, I'm grateful that something good has come from my failures, even though I know that doesn't erase the harm I caused to you and the other people I wronged. As their conversation drew to a close, David made an unexpected proposal that surprised Derek and offered him an opportunity to contribute more directly to the civil rights reforms that had emerged from his case. "Mr. Morrison, I'd like you to consider participating in a video training program for airline employees, sharing your story as a case study in how bias can compromise professional judgment and describing the personal consequences of discriminatory behavior." Derek accepted David's proposal without hesitation, understanding that sharing his story publicly would be both humiliating and necessary if he wanted to contribute meaningfully to preventing similar incidents in the future. The video training program would ensure that Derek's failures became learning opportunities for thousands of airline employees, while his documented transformation process would demonstrate that change was possible, even for someone who had failed as dramatically as he had. When they parted ways outside the coffee shop, David Washington and Derek Morrison shook hands for the first time since their confrontation on Flight 847, not as symbols of discrimination and justice, but as two men who had found a way to transform a moment of ugliness into an opportunity for understanding and growth that would benefit countless other people in the years to come. The viral video that destroyed Derek Morrison's career also became the catalyst for the most comprehensive anti-discrimination reforms in aviation history. The Morrison protocols implemented across all major airlines require de-escalation training and passenger advocate programs that have reduced discrimination complaints by 78%, while creating accountability measures that ensure individual bias cannot hide behind institutional authority. Derek now travels the country sharing his story with airline employees, law enforcement, and corporate leaders, carrying a message that authority without accountability becomes oppression. But authentic change is always possible when people face their failures honestly and commit to becoming better than they were. His daughter Emma, now studying civil rights law, often introduces his presentations proud of the man her father has become, through the difficult work of confronting his prejudices and learning to see the humanity in everyone he encounters. David Washington was promoted to Deputy FAA Administrator, where he continues building bridges between communities and the aviation industry, while ensuring that the reforms inspired by his experience create lasting change rather than temporary compliance. When asked about Derek's transformation, David says, "Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about creating space for people to become better than they were, because that's how we build a world where everyone can fly with dignity." If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true stories about justice transformation and the power of human dignity. Share your thoughts in the comments about how we can continue building a more fair and respectful society for everyone.